Jesus said, "I am the resurrection and I am life. Anyone who believes in me, even though they die, yet shall they live. And everyone who lives and believes in me will never die." Those words sound familiar at all to you? Not just because you heard them this morning. When else have you heard them? At a funeral, thank you. Yeah. Many pastors begin many funerals with those words. In the most trying times, in the bleakest of circumstances, when sadness is at its worst, and it's most difficult to hold on to hope, we hear these words. In the very moment when it seems clear that death has won, Jesus shares words of life. He has the power over death, and not just spiritual death, but physical death as well. We know this, don't we? That's why you're sitting here this morning. To once again affirm that Jesus is the I am. The true life is held in and offered from his hand. He said so himself. Last week we acknowledged what? That Jesus is what? See, they remembered. He protects, guards, guides, feeds, watches over, cares for, loves his flock, and he knows each of us by name. He even lays down his life for his sheep. Today's I am statement, the fifth I am statement, goes further to challenge us to accept that his care extends far beyond giving us what we need for today. He has made a way that even death is not the last word, and he invites us to do this one thing Pastor Nancy just asked the kids to do, to believe. To believe that Jesus is the resurrection and the life, and to do so in the most extremely difficult moments of our lives, even when we face the reality of physical transformation and transition from this life to our eternal one for those we love and for ourselves. It's not a simple nor easy thing to trust this particular I am statement, as the scripture indicates. It wasn't simple or easy for Mary and Martha, two of Jesus' closest friends. As we heard, the context for this particular I am statement is the story of the raising of Lazarus, likely familiar to many of us. I think there's a lot to learn in those. It was a long scripture, I understand, and there's so much packed into it. But I would like to share with you three of the best things we can do to embrace Jesus as the resurrection and the life, as the scripture implies. But before we do that, I think it's important for us to do one thing, and that is to put ourselves in the shoes of Mary and Martha and understand the main point of this incredible miracle. That even though you may feel close to Jesus and have a very secure relationship with him, there will likely come a time or times in your life, if it hasn't happened already, that you may be so distraught, so distressed and sad that it takes a miracle to prove that God has not forgotten you, especially in the midst of death. That there is hope and healing beyond what we can possibly believe without faith. The miracle of the raising of Lazarus is just that. Through Jesus, there is resurrection, and in him, there is life. As Jesus traveled from Jerusalem, in the area of Jerusalem, he often visited the home of Mary and Martha and Lazarus, who was their brother. And these three had developed a very close and special relationship with Jesus. However, although they were very close to him, their lives were not free of heartache and despair. Maybe you can relate. Lazarus gets very sick while Jesus is away. Mary and Martha ask for Jesus to come, but he stays where he is because God has a greater objective for him in waiting. Under protest of the disciples, who fear they or Jesus may be killed, Jesus agrees 2 days later to return to Bethany, but during that time, Lazarus dies. Mary and Martha are devastated. Jesus came, but too late. Jesus could have healed his friend. Instead, Lazarus has been dead for 4 days. Martha and Mary have their responses, of course. Martha seems to exhibit some faith, but she is heartbroken. She tells Jesus God will do whatever he asks. And she was not asking Jesus to bring Lazarus back to life. She was simply clinging to her faith during what must have been one of the most difficult times in her life. We do the same thing. We want to trust and believe like Martha, but the circumstances around us deeply challenge us to do so. It's not a lack of faith, but it's the struggle to believe beyond a seemingly impossible situation. Can anything be more final than death? Can anything be more challenging than believing the reality of life beyond death? And it's not just the certainty of physical death that causes us to feel this way. There are many instances and circumstances we feel the same sense of hopelessness, not just at the death of someone we love. And those other moments are just as real and just as heartbreaking for us. We may not abandon our faith in such times, but we certainly struggle with it if we're being honest. Mary is simply overwhelmed with grief. She says to Jesus, "Lord, if you only had been here, my brother would not have died." Jesus hears her faltering faith and sees it in the other mourners and becomes deeply troubled, the scripture says. In the translation we use today, it states that Jesus became deeply angry. You ask the question, why? Why did Jesus get angry? Well, it was not because he was mad at them. He wasn't mad at Mary because she was upset. He was mad because Mary and others had something to be so sad about. And so after weeping himself and out of his deep compassion, Jesus miraculously showed that physical death is not final. I'm sure you have seen someone who is so overwhelmed with sadness that they just can't seem to see beyond it. Maybe you've been there yourself. Jesus' answer to both women and to us is the promise of resurrection and life through him. The question that needs our answer is the same one Jesus asked of Martha. Do you believe this? Do you? In answering that question with a yes, there are 3 things to consider. The first is this: if Jesus is to be the resurrection and the life to us, then we will have to acknowledge that God's timing is better than ours. Have you ever been in a situation where you really wanted God to act? You wanted him to do something, to provide an answer, anything that would help you move forward through a problem or difficulty, or to help you make a really important decision, only to find that God is silent on the matter and not moving anywhere near as fast as you want him to. Well, so did Mary and Martha. Creates a lot of anxiety, doesn't it? You can blame it on something called instant gratification. Our world is filled with those seeking it, and our culture caters to it. It's not new. It's something we were born with. We've sought after since we were infants. But there's a skill we need to learn and to practice to combat this tendency we all have to want whatever it is now to satisfy or make us feel better or even to take away pain, as in the case of Lazarus' death. It's called patience. And when it comes to God meeting the need we think we have, we must learn to accept that God's ways are not our ways and that his timing is often different from ours. How many times have we heard of the stories of people who did not understand why God didn't immediately do something to fix a problem in their life, only for them to share how after the difficulty had passed, it was a blessing to them that they did not get what they were asking for when they asked for it? This past Wednesday, Pastor Nancy shared a devotion during staff prayer from a book by Max Lucado that spoke to the issue of healing and God's timing. Lucado wrote this: God will heal you instantly or gradually or ultimately. So God's will is to heal us, and often that happens immediately. Sometimes God's will is that healing takes time, sometimes years or decades or even a lifetime. But just maybe healing doesn't come in the span of a lifetime, but it does come ultimately or finally. God's timing is best. Had Jesus not waited, the miracle of raising Lazarus from the dead would not have taken place. Likewise, if we want to experience the best God has to offer us, we will have to accept and live according to God's timing. If we believe, we must trust. And I know what you'd like to say to me at this moment, that it's easier said than done, right? Right? Well, I agree. And you should know that preachers often preach to themselves. Second, if Jesus is to be the resurrection and the life to us, then we must allow God to be the one in control. I know you've heard this before, but it's worth hearing again. Nobody likes to admit that they want to be in control, but we do it mostly to avoid unpleasant circumstances. And it makes sense for us to do that. It's a means of self-preservation. Nobody wants to feel uncomfortable. But the thing is, God would rather he be the one to preserve us and keep us, especially when the negative circumstances of life arise. And he does a much better job of it than we do. Mary and Martha tried to maintain control of a situation they could not possibly ever be able to do. So my question is, what are you trying to control this morning? The opposite of control is surrender. And it's just the thing that we need to do to embrace the gift of Jesus. Martha, even in her moment of struggling faith, was able to do this when she answered yes to Jesus' question. And that offers hope to us as well. Often for people of faith, the very best thing we can do when trouble strikes and obstacles arise is ironically what? Nothing. Nothing outside of giving those concerns to God rather than trying to manage them on our own. But what's our default? We have to be in control. We have to manage it ourselves. Well, I think the scripture points to the fact that we ought to be giving control to the one who defeated death itself. He's much more capable than we are to handle what we really can't. The third thing, lastly, and of greatest encouragement, is this. We need to recognize that Jesus has the last word. There isn't a more hopeless situation to consider than the one we hear in the death of Lazarus. Martha thinks it's so helpless and hopeless that even Jesus can't do anything about it. 4 days dead, the stench must be awful. But note Jesus' response. He says to her, "Didn't I tell you that you would see God's glory if you believe?" Then he prayed. And then he spoke to the very dead Lazarus. He says, "Come out." And the final word to Lazarus was not death, but resurrection and life. If Jesus can speak life into death, then what can't he do when we are faced with the trials of our lives? Is there anything he can't redeem and save? Is there anything he can't fix or restore? And I don't mean to say that he will according to our timetable, and especially if we attempt to hold on to the control over it. However, he has the last word, and it's an obvious understatement to say that it's to our benefit. But it all comes down to just one question. You may have answered it before. My guess is you probably have, or you wouldn't take a gorgeous day like this to spend it starting in church. Do you believe? I don't mean for you to answer that by giving a simple yes, because faith is a lot more than giving intellectual assent. To know Jesus as the resurrection and the life means more than knowing. It means learning and practicing patience and surrender over and over and over again, and doing so at the most difficult times of our lives, including death of those we love and as we consider our own. Jesus has the last word, and if we're willing to listen, he will speak life into every day and every challenge along the way. Pray to understand his timing. In the moments when control is slipping from your hands, trust him and put it in his. In the end, or what seemed like the end, Jesus asked Martha, "Do you believe?" He asks the same of us. Jesus is the bread of life. He is the light of the world. He is the gate and the good shepherd. And Jesus is the resurrection and the life. Then